Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today, joined by two of the members of the team. One of those is Eric Darling Bond. If you're playing with your keep track of your team at home playing cards, Eric, you want to say a greeting to the people that are out there.
I give a greeting to all the good people that are out there, and even those who are a little morally gray. You know, You're doing the best you can.
I understand. And of course, I have Chris Capola with me. And Chris, these are good people that Eric just mentioned out here, and they're out there. So maybe you should say hi to the good people.
Hi to the good people. I do want to say they know how litigious I am. They were just skirting around my hi to the good people. Number two, with your trading cards, we did have the suggestion. I do think we might want to start like a Fork in Time fantasy league. You can draft people. You can, get points based upon certain things. For example, when I talk about the Congress of Vienna, when there's a barbecue argument, things like that.
Yeah.
So that might be something we're thinking about.
Yeah, I was sharing with Chris and with Eric here this concept of I've done this past in the workplace, and I was actually thinking about that from this week. Have you ever created like a bingo card for one of the people that you know for, like, you may have seen these online, like a meeting bingo? For example, now with all the virtual meetings that we have, it's like, invariably one of your squares should be you're muted. Because you're going to hear that in basically every meeting that you're ever in is you're on mute. And I was mentioning, one of mine that I know my colleagues would point out to is I have my version of KISS, the Keep It Simple Stupid. I've never liked Keep It Simple Stupid, so I have my version of that. I think I'm going to write a book on that, so I'm not going to tell you what it is. I need to save it for our listeners to be able to buy the book. But I've got one of my things my dad said to me once when I worked with him one summer. I came back with an answer to a question that had a precise answer. Huh?
Hold the flashlight straight.
Well, yeah, he didn't have to say that. I learned that after being whopped upside the head a couple of times. I learned, by the way, holding a flashlight is an art. There's an art to it, doing it right. And but I came back and he asked a question about something that I should have known a precise answer for. And I think I said, I think ... whatever it was. And he sort of stopped and he looked at me and said, son, let's don't be thinking, let's be knowing. And so I often quote him, because a lot of times in the business world, when somebody says, I think, and it's like, we can know. Let's don't be thinking, let's be knowing kind of thing. So, by the way, all that's fair. Chris, I may put out on the website, this will also be a tease to get our listeners to go to the website to download their A Fork in Time bingo cards along your idea here that they can fill out with, and we'll see who comes up with the first bingo as something that we do. That might be a fun thing to do. But you're right. Barbecue arguments, mentions of the Congress of Vienna. Versailles is going to get mentioned by somebody. Yeah. You can count on it at some point. I'm going to make some reference to stopping either World War I or World War II. These are the things that are running themes. Alexis will have a box or two that have obviously something to do with English history. That's just an absolute given. So we'll get them out there.
Eric Rush is going to kill a president.
He will.
Yeah.
Or save him, as the case may be.
Right.
But yeah, if it's presidents and it's health, we've got a resident expert in Dr. Rush, so we're good to go there. All right, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. Actually, that's not true. We're going to get a president killed. We're going to get a president killed.
No, we are not. We are not going to get a president killed. We are going to get a president-elect killed.
Yeah. We would never be so uncouth as to have a president killed on this podcast.
Understood. All right, so I'm going to toss it over to Eric to introduce our topic for today, and we're going to go American electoral politics, early moving towards mid 20th century. That's the era that we're targeting towards here. So Eric, lead us down the historical what did and get us to that magical thing called the fork, the historical what if.
I'd be happy to, John. I always, in the midst of the winter blues, I like to look forward to a bright and beautiful future. February, which is the start of spring here in Arizona. And when I think of February, I think of my favorite holiday, President's Day. And you know what we celebrate on President's Day? We celebrate Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, but we might not have that because 2 days before it, on February 17th, February 15th, 1933, President-elect FDR will be assassinated in Florida by Giuseppe Zangara, an Italian immigrant to the United States. For any Sondheim fans out there, you might see his story recounted in the musical Assassins, where he was blaming his stomach cancer on the president, but because he was unable to kill Hoover in Washington, he went down to Miami to kill Roosevelt. He was unable to do so, mostly because of his height. He was unable to stand on a chair for very long to shoot the president-elect in his car, only getting, I believe, the mayor of Chicago.
I believe, wounded. He might have wounded Roosevelt, but he did kill the mayor of Chicago.
Yeah, Mayor Anton Cermak of Chicago.
So we have the president-elect of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who doesn't get to make I guess this is during the period of time when we haven't make
the point.
Yeah, we haven't moved to the January 20th inauguration date, correct?
There was a constitutional amendment that was passed, and this term we're talking about is actually the last time that a president will take office in March.
Okay.
Roosevelt's second term in all of the timelines, the president, whoever wins the election of 1936, regardless of anything else, which, gee, I don't want to give too much away, might as well just have done that, but is going to be inaugurated on January 20th.
Okay, so this is the last time we're moving towards the March inauguration path, which is why this can happen in February to the president-elect versus the actual recently inaugurated president.
Correct. This is the first time. Now that I'm thinking of it, I don't think we've ever had a situation where a president-elect died before taking office. So this would be a constitutional crisis. So I guess we're just going to go with the vice president assuming the role. I think everybody's just going to take it as a given of, well, they were elected on a ticket together. And so if FDR is no longer the president because of the assassination, we will have to go with his vice presidential candidate.
And also remembering this is during the period of time, which I think we've talked about on a couple of other episodes. One pops into my head. There was no amendment that was in place that prescribed how you replace the vacancy that existed in the vice presidency as well. So under this scenario, again, we're making the assumption that the vice president-elect will be inaugurated as will essentially become the de facto president-elect and thus therefore inaugurated as the president, but will do so without a vice president being inaugurated, correct?
That is correct. And also, there might even be more complications because John Nance Gardner, who was FDR's first vice president out of several, he was born in Texas. He was a member of the House of Representatives from Texas, but he was also born when Texas was a military district in 1868 during the Civil War, or after the Civil War. So a lot of fun facts on this one. This is like if John McCain, if someone said he couldn't be president because he was born in Panama.
He was born in the Panama Canal Zone, not the nation of Panama. If we're talking about it, let's,
Yeah, let's be specific. And he would have still been eligible because his parents were American citizens.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. The John McCain birtherism movement dies where it starts here on this podcast.
Said the member of the team who lives in Arizona, of course, logically.
Of course.
Yeah. So under this scenario, we get now we get a whole. This is also punching one of your bingo cards here. You know, real Texas presidents also get populated here with a nod to Chris. But this gets Garner in the presidency in 33, having been elected as the vice president in 32. And Eric, you're suggesting that that's obviously the fork. This is where it goes, but that has ramifications that go beyond that, correct?
That is correct. Now, during his time as Roosevelt's vice president, because John Nance Garner was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, it was very much kind of that same relationship JFK had with Lyndon Bird Johnson of this is the guy who is actually an experienced politician who is able to get through most of the through a great deal of the legislation. He's able to help bring the New Deal along. But now we are before the New Deal and before Garner and FDR's relationship was permanently ruptured because Garner was not a fan of the more centralized powers of the New Deal.
I would make the argument specifically that Roosevelt had a little more political experience than one term as a senator and writing a good book.
That is true. He found the March of Dimes, for goodness sake.
You know what? You might just need to have a Chris bingo card, a shot at, like making fun of JFK's experience. I might be able to fill out my own.
I think we will have multiple cards. Some of them may cover multiple team participants, but there may be in fact, that may be what the challenge that I give to each member of our team. A lot of them aren't here. They get to suggest what their own card looks like. And then to your point, Chris, our listeners can adopt them to see which one they think will fill up first.
Yeah.
That may be a way to go. Or at least the elements can get crossed between the various ones that are there.
I think we would have to do them for each other because I will try to stack the deck.
Yeah, that's the thing. These are organically just happening. Like, you don't want to have somebody guiding it to, yeah.
Yeah. In fact, we're better off if we're in the dark, right? If we don't know.
Yeah.
I just don't know how we do that. We'll work on that, and that's an assignment. Maybe I'll bring I'll bring the co-founder in since she's been a little bit busy, with having a child and all that, and give her something to do here.
And I will think the results will be more fair than Cook County in 1960.
Oh, there you go. See, then we have to make a decision about whether direct or indirect references count, right? Oh, speaking of Texans who assume the office.
Yeah, I guess Nance would be the only other one, right?
That assumed because
the presidency.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, they're from Texas, where we understand what barbecue really is. Again, another deep cut for our listeners. We're running off the rails here, so I'm going to get us back on the tracks just a little bit.
Running off the rails, we have a presidential term under John Nance Garner, who, while he did seek out the presidential nomination for the Democrats, lost it to FDR and then agreed to become FDR's running mate. But aside from helping smooth the passage of the New Deal, there's no New Deal at this time. No one has any idea of how to solve the Depression, except one man who has been biding his time, waiting in the Senate, and now can seize the chance because FDR is not popular anymore because he's dead. The Kingfish, governor of Louisiana, the man who brought a 90% literacy rate to that great state and is now serving in the Senate and is not doing such a great job because there was technically a political standoff. Huey Kingfish Long. Chris, is there anything you would like to inform the good people about the Kingfish?
Nothing jumps to mind. I think this is an interesting point just to talk about. Nance would be unrecognizable politically, I would think, to a modern American understanding of political ideology.
He may have been unrecognizable to a 1930s American understanding of political ideology.
Just that he's the fact that he would be considered a Democrat. He's very much the conservative Southern wing of this party. Somewhat what certain people thought they were getting with Johnson, but I think he wasn't. And you're right that you're not going to see the progressive policies you did under Roosevelt. You would see those under Huey Long, though. Now, I do want to put a very fine point on something, Eric. In our timeline, he's not alive in the 1936 presidential election, correct?
That is correct. He was assassinated in 1935.
So in this case, somehow, without the help of Eric Rush, we have both done one one presidential assassination, prevented another, and here we are with Huey Long running in 1936 as the Democratic nominee.
So a little background on Long is a character, no doubt, in American politics, a personality, no doubt. For the average listener to the podcast, what do you think the primary thing I'll throw it out to you both, to Chris and you, Eric. What is the thing you think that most of them immediately think of? What's the given that you think about with Long if you're an informed historical listener? And what might be the surprise that maybe initially doesn't come to mind, but it's an important thing to remember about him? Chris, do you have an answer maybe to either or both of those?
Mental image would be, actually, there was a movie John Goodman did on the Kingfish. That sticks in my head. The other one being how interesting this is about to get, because I think that Long, earlier you had talked about I promise I'm not trying to fill up the bingo card, but here I go. Right. You had mentioned Napoleon earlier. And Napoleon
off podcast, by the way.
Yes. And Napoleon's one of those people that in France today, the left see him as a Republican, the right see him as Mr. Law and Order. Both people can see the thing they want in him. And I really feel like Huey Long could easily be that, could have a similar thing. He does have what he's famous for as governor of Louisiana before he becomes senator is his Share the Wealth program. Well, that sure doesn't sound conservative at all. But he also has when he actually was assassinated, he was shot by, correct me if I'm wrong, the son of a judge. And basically, this person thought that his father should have gotten an appointment that Huey Long prevented him. He was very corrupt. He very much built a political machine. So, looking at that I'm not saying anybody's out here supporting corruption, but both sides very much can claim some of his legacy.
He's that, the concept that you hear about in politics is grave robbing, when you go and essentially rob some concept from the other party's history in the process. What you're saying is these guys are ripe for being grave robbed in a way. It's the lens you want to see them through. When you're describing Napoleon there and even Long there, what occurred to me is Forrest Gump, actually, of all things in my head, because if you remember the phenomena of, Forrest Gump as a novel, particularly as a movie in the early 90s, he was latched onto by both conservatives and liberals at the same time, because inside of this persona, you could find things that you could either identify or twist either way, if that makes any sense.
Yes. And Chris, I double checked. Carl Weiss, the guy who assassinated Huey Long, he was the son-in-law of a judge.
Okay.
which is like, wow, I've tried to impress my in-laws, but never to that extent.
So one of the first questions I have about this fork is, even before we get to the point of, we get to the 36 election and Long runs, and I guess what we talked about off podcast was this idea of how Long becomes president is he wins the 36 election. But as was already mentioned here, it's a very different 1933, whether FDR is sitting in the Oval Office versus John Nance Garner is sitting in the Oval Office. I mean, is that part of what fuels the scenario that gets to the point of where Long can be a successful candidate in 36? Or I guess, do we want to talk anything at all about the presidency, which we've already determined, I guess, off podcast and by where we're going here, is short-lived? There ain't going to be a second term for Mr. John Nance Garner.
No. Chris, and I think you had alluded to this. When FDR was first running for president, he was running as a strict fiscal conservative who felt roughly a fiscal conservative for the time, who later developed the idea of the New Deal and having more of a role for the centralized government in providing work programs and putting tighter financial controls on banks. This was seen by some as going too extreme, to the point where we get things like the business plot, where American businessmen attempted to have Smedley Butler, the most ridiculous named American general, placed as a strongman for the United States. And then there were people like Huey Long who felt it didn't go far enough to address it, like his program of sharing the wealth, which was in effect kind of like putting a cap on how much Americans could earn, and then having that reinvested. People said of Huey Long, like, well, that's communism. And he said, this is what prevents communism.
So first, I think Roosevelt was not running as a fiscal conservative at the time. I think that's kind of what sunk Hoover, is that he, secondly, Smedley Butler, amazing guy, wrote a book called I Was a Gangster for Capitalism. So not exactly who you'd expect the business plot to go with. The fact that they went with him was the fact they went with him is hilarious if you do some looking at Smedley Butler. But yeah, I do feel like I honestly feel like, in all honesty, one of the knocks against Roosevelt is how much he centralized power in the presidency. He started doing it. There was even the suggestion of expanding the Supreme Court so that his policies could be pushed through. That wound up not going, but I almost see Roosevelt and Long as almost competitors because they are so similar, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And when I say fiscal conservative, I mean he was more towing the line of what was conventional, because unfortunately, even now, our political vocabulary is not a direct one-for-one to what was the style of the 1930s. Talk about seeing things through the modern lens too much.
And I think this is really interesting. The difference between Gardner and either a Roosevelt or a Long, it's hard to understand these three people being in the same party. They are very different ideologically.
And the parties had different. I've talked about this before. This would fill out my bingo card at some point when you start talking about American political history, is when you have winner take all, the electrical structure of the United States with the winner take all approach inevitably lends to a two-party system being the predominant system over time. That's not to say that third parties don't exist, but one of two things happens to those third parties. They displace one of the other two parties, or their issues, if they're prominent enough, become co-opted by one of the two parties because there's no place to stick around for very long as a quote unquote viable third party because there's no outlet with you not being the chance of being one of the two majority parties because that's how seats are elected and things get done. Certainly at the presidential level, even with the electoral college, and even to the extent that you have districts that may flow one way or the other, it's still a winner take all system. So again, we start talking about the party labels and what they stand for. Democrats and Republicans have morphed over time on a number of issues, swapped positions even on some issues, or you've had, because of the quote unquote big tent phenomena of parties and this electoral thing, you can have pretty broad philosophical differences inside of the same tent because it's all about making the tent big enough to win the elections.
Right.
And so that's how you can have these three folks all inside of that tent, even though it seems like a weird tent to have everybody inside of, right? And the other thing I guess is important here. I want to hear the thoughts of each of you on this. The backdrop here is unique for a lot of reasons, but the most important reason it's unique is an economic situation that has, while there have been panics and there have been other recessions, to use a term that we use now, the reason we call this the Great Depression, it was a unique outlier event in terms of how capitalism and government were going to interact with each other. Is that a fair thing to say?
I would say so. That, yes. It's a little overwhelming to consider.
Yeah, and the result of that is there are thoughts that would not have been considered in a very short period of time before coming from either party, things that are suddenly that were never thought of before that are on the table, right? That I guess that's my point.
Yeah, like there had always been kind of a lighter touch of the government towards economic policy. Like Grover Cleveland during the crises in Texas during his presidential term said, like, well, it is the job of the American citizen to support the US government. It is not the job of the US government to support its citizens. And frankly, with a lot of them, it was seen as, well, what are we supposed to do to intervene, like where politicians were not businesses? What is supposed to be the point of our regulation? As there wasn't there was a dearth of strategies on how to approach something like an economic depression of this size.
So much so, I'm sorry, Eric, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to bring up, and the attempts to, like, even during the initial stock market crash, which, was a freak thing. Like, it was a period, but nobody thought a depression was going to happen until it just suddenly came about. It was that they had tried to do a similar trick that JP Morgan had tried during the early 1900s of creating a stable stock that could have the market bounce back. It just didn't work. And nobody knows how to fix it unless you're looking over to Europe, like in Germany or in Italy or Spain, to where people are seeing, like, wow, it seems like the madness of markets can only be tamed by one truly strong man.
Yeah. Which is to your point, Chris, about why there is even the desire to pack the court, is there's challenges about what is the rightful place of a Congress or a president in terms of intervening in a crisis like this, right? That's why you have to pack the court, is there's lawsuits filing left and right saying you can't do this is unconstitutional, this is everything else.
Also, just economic theory wise, I mean, I'm not going to get too deep into it, but this was a major change recently. Around now, you had what were called Keynesians, John Maynard Keynes, coming out and writing books about the fact that government might actually have a role in, without getting too technical, basically providing money, just printing money and buying things as a consumer when the market isn't providing enough consumers. And even theoretically, this was very controversial. So, you still had a lot of people who had gone to school, studied economics, saying the best thing you can do is to not intervene at all, especially because, as I just said, printing money, buying things as a government, yeah, you can prop things up, you can keep things going. The outcome of that is inflation. And you want to see what's going on in Germany, what had just happened in Germany with their hyperinflation. So it was controversial whether the U.S. government could do this. It was controversial whether it should do this.
Right. And, that medical concept we've talked about before, first do no harm, before you go and actually do something, what you do to actually, okay, you saved the patient. In the process, you killed the patient, or you did this, to the patient kind of thing, I think was a lot of the thought that was there. And there was that idea of, the free hand, the idea of capitalism is yes, this is harsh, but it will correct itself because it will correct itself, right? And the question was, how long do you let it go before it corrects itself? And you had sat through the latter part of the Hoover administration from 29 with, okay, we're going to let it correct itself, and it hasn't really corrected itself now. So what are we going to do? And that's the Roosevelt, impetus coming in with the New Deal. So before we get down to Mr. Long assuming the office, I want to get there. What does happen during the Nance presidency? Is it just more? Is it Hoover with a D versus Hoover with an R? I mean, what do we see in that? For the period of time, it's going to be a little bit less than 4 years because it's happening in March instead of happening in January. But it's 4 years of John Nance Garner, right?
I think it's for almost indistinguishable from 4 more years of Hoover.
Yeah,
I think
Hoover with a D is correct. Of just because even then it's still just like we can't do anything, but we feel slightly more bad about it than the other guys do.
And the thing that just occurred to me, something I feel like I should know, given I have a degree in this. I'm trying to remember what actually I know the presidency obviously in 32 changes with Roosevelt's election. Was there actually a flip in Congress before then or at the same time? What was the congressional landscape? I just don't remember.
The Congress, I believe, flipped in the 1930 election, because that was right in the Great Depression had already happened. And the reason I say that, John Nance Garner assumed the speakership in 31 after the 30 election.
Right.
So it was a relatively new Democratic majority, but it was an existing Democratic majority that just carried over.
So the reason I asked that question, that's what I thought I remembered, and I'm just looking up stuff here on the fly. The Senate flipped in 32, which made it then now a majority, which now made it a majority Democratic Congress, not just the House from 30. I guess my question, the reason I asked that question is I've described Garner here as, Hoover with a D versus, in terms of the presidential idea where it is, because where he comes from in terms of being in that wing of the party. Is there a possibility that, Garner may not be excited about this, but he gets pushed to places he wasn't expecting to go by pressure from congressional Democrats?
I don't believe that at all.
No.
I think it very much worked the other way, in that Roosevelt had to push congressional Democrats where he wanted to go, especially on whatever he did on civil rights, on equal participation in all of these programs. He had to basically allow, for example, the process of redlining. He had to allow that to get Southern Democrats to actually vote for it. Just because they had a D for their name didn't mean they were going to support the truly radical policies that Roosevelt was pushing for.
Yeah, they would still be thinking of like tariff. Can a tariff fix this? I think a tariff could do the trick. We're importing so much.
So the place that I go, again, I'm okay with us getting to the long things. I think it's practical that there would have to be somebody that would rise up inside of the Democratic Party to take on the incumbent president. A very rare thing, by the way, but does it obviously happen? If I recall, the Republican candidate in 36 was Alf Landon, who was from Kansas and was a Republican. Do we think we still have? I guess my question, we talked about what would change here on the Democratic side with Long maybe coming along and rising to a place of more prominence because of Roosevelt being out of the picture and Garner being less of an influencing factor there in that direction. The other possibility that exists of the thing that this changes up is it turns the 1936 election into something that the Republicans now feel like they might be able to win it back, right?
I'd be interested to think about this. I think the Republicans look at the electoral shellacking they took in 32, and they actually live up to being the party of Lincoln. They see that progressive policies actually are very popular. So I think they may, because, Roosevelt's a blip at this point. I think they see that his policies or what he ran on or these new ideas coming out would have been very popular. So maybe they try and co-opt them and lean on the Teddy Roosevelt wing of the party, the old Lincoln, the very progressive, because there was still a lot of that. It hadn't solidified yet. I think Roosevelt helped solidify what we would still recognize as democratic policies.
Yeah.
I think they may try and co-opt those because, as we've talked about in previous episodes where we've talked about party politics in the early 20th century, if you talk about full integration of the civil service, that was actually Teddy Roosevelt. If you talk about recognizing and supporting labor unions, that was Roosevelt in the coal strikes. If you talk about screening Birth of a Nation in the White House, that was Wilson. So these things that may not, if you were to put a policy out there and ask politically involved people which way they thought on it, you can't really, you can't use modern parties to predict. This is where that starts. And I think the Republicans may, realize that, hey, politically, there's some hay to be made by adopting some of these. So I don't know if they run as basically another Hoover, which is what Alf Landon would have been.
Yeah. So, part of the reason I raise that as a question is, again, this idea of, co-opting, you actually use the term, Chris, that got Roosevelt elected. Now, he didn't live long enough to take office, but that got Roosevelt elected. So in the 34 elections, for example, now that the House has and the Senate have both flipped, Congress is now Democratic. Do you see the first inklings of what you just described there long before it's not Alf Landon? We have to figure out who the Republican is in 36 who comes along, who's able to carry that banner. But, it may start in the 34 congressional elections with this idea of the Republicans are going to tack more in the direction of where Roosevelt had gone on a national electoral scale. Maybe not even so much to go in the direction of Roosevelt, but to go in the direction away from Hoover because they saw what that did for them, right? And then the question is, where is a Huey Long in 36 in the middle of what's going on with that, where there's a little bit of a full scale shift, perhaps by both parties, scrambling for a new part of the American electorate.
I think Huey Long was such a party machine guy. He can't change that letter. But right. I'll hear what Eric's got to.
I would say we would probably see a Democratic Party divided mostly by regional loyalties and regional ideologies because, like John Nance Gardner, as opposed to Roosevelt, he was anti-union and anti-labor strikes, which for a lot of Democrats who came from more urbanized areas was their main base of support. That with Southern labor groups before going more into civil rights as part of that. So I would see it as Huey Long would say, we've had enough of Gardner, we've had enough of do nothing policies. Let me lead the country like I led Louisiana. Let me share the wealth. Because I think that would be especially attractive without the New Deal, without that kind of half measure, as he saw it, of people saying, like, you know what? At least it's something. That is something very easy for me to latch on to as an idea. Because, you know, we've seen that with technocratic presidencies like the scientificos in Mexico at that time, to where they had like, yes, we have these very gradual policies that will eventually work out, but it's very hard to capitalize on that for an election. Whereas with Huey Long, especially because the man had a theme song, "Every Man a King" is a real bop, as the children say.
Yeah. And of course, we know that, Long was already, even with Roosevelt, in the real timeline, Long was already viewed as being a challenger to Roosevelt before his assassination in 1935. There was already talk of, this fracture in, again, as you point out, Chris, it's a big tent. There's a lot of room in that tent, and there's room to divide that tent theoretically, right? And so you could have seen much more the challenge from Long, even to an incumbent Roosevelt. Again, that we've now moved out of the picture in our alternate timeline, and it's easy to move John Nance Garner out of the picture, right? But at least more theoretically. But the idea exists there that you may have seen this morphing of the parties, as you've already described there. Both Chris and Eric have already described that into being different things. And I was just looking through and trying to remember from my history and then things I was looking at here on the fly. Was there even really a viable third party out there to maybe suddenly use this as a chance to try to get, a cleavage line or place of leverage? But I don't think I think there was the Union Party out there. There was another party that was floating around, but nothing that was really viable enough to come along and jump in and, what we've seen in the past. There was a point in time where there weren't Republicans and Democrats. There were the Democratic Republicans, and there were a bunch of Whigs. The Whigs are long since gone because eventually they got displaced. In the late 19th century, you had the Populist Party and the Greenback parties and other things that they were co-opted by the major parties at that point. I don't see a viable third party that comes along that takes advantage of this fracture that already exists. So the race in 1836, so let's say Long is the nominee. Is it a guy like Alf Landon? Is that really what the Republicans put up under that scenario, or is it something different? It's hard to talk about this Long candidacy in 36 without talking about, is that really who is it really going to be Long over Landon versus Long over somebody else? Because if it's Long, it ain't going to be Landon. Any thoughts, Eric?
I'm going to the Republican primary for that year to see who else he was running against.
Okay, Chris, it looked like you had maybe a thought out there.
Yeah, I would say I think there's going to be a rush to pick up the progressive banner. I think it would be interesting to see, because this is still experimental. It hasn't been tried, really. And I think there's, one of the reasons that the two parties have constantly co-opted third parties is because they have legitimate points, and each party will often race to pick up those votes.
Right.
And I think if you have a clear long run on the Democratic side, I think you might be able to see a Republican Alf Landon, just because they realize that, you know what, there's still enough votes. There's still some votes out there for fiscal conservative, for just staying the course. Because the one thing we haven't thought about, haven't discussed, and this is a huge issue, what's going on in the economy?
I was about to ask that question. If you don't have the New Deal activist Roosevelt intervention,
Mhm.
I mean, the classic thing that I remember, sort of from history is that, what really ended the Depression? World War II. At the end of the day, that's what really ended the Depression. You want to talk about what really changed things along, but the economy had corrected itself to some degree in the past, taking time, at the expense of people along the way. By the way, that's the nature of what happens there. But Chris, I'll just throw it out to you. What do you think happens if laissez-faire is more of what's allowed to continue after 33 by the time we get to 36? Because the mantra of American presidential politics tends to be, it's the economy, stupid.
And this is an interesting question. I think we're still petering along, but more importantly, I think it may be the economy, stupid, but it's also the emotions of the economy. I think it's the important thing about Roosevelt's policies is that people thought something was happening. People felt like something was being tried. And that's not going to happen under Alf. That's not going to happen under John Nance Gardner. He's not going to keep trying things. He's going to fall back on this classical economist method of the market will correct itself. Well, when you take your hands and throw them up and say it's not my job, I can't really do anything. I mean, one argument is how much can the American president affect the economy?
Right.
But it certainly determines who the American president is. And sometimes it's just how people feel about the economy that's more important. And I think that a Gardner is not going to get people excited and active about the economy. So it's not going to matter where it's at, actually, almost.
And I did a quick look. William Borah was a person who had ran against Alf Landon, and he was an old Roosevelt in that he had supported Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressive Party, but people felt he was too extreme for the Republicans to win. So in a field that also included people trying to get Herbert Hoover to run again for president, they went with Alf Landon.
Yeah, because in the real timeline, the 36th Republican presidential nominee is a sacrificial lamb. Mm-hmm. In the real timeline. In our alternate forked timeline here, it's not quite obviously that scenario. And so you get, part of what's always difficult here, this is why I did appreciate so often when Brent was able to join us, because off the top of his head, he could name a lot of these folks that would never come to mind without me doing the research. Is the people that come out of the woodwork in our alternate 1936 and 1836 for that matter too, but our alternate 1936 are very different than the people who were there that we know about from our 1936, because it's a different 1936, right? Mm-hmm. And so, to Eric's point, they're probably, and to your point earlier, Chris, there's probably somebody who represents that more progressive heritage of the Republican Party who is much more willing maybe to get out in front, because it's not the lamb being led to the slaughter getting out in front, because now there's something different about the story to be told, the narrative to be told, and the outcome, if you're a politician, to be told that you actually have a chance to win, that you may bring somebody else out of the woodwork. I keep thinking about midterm elections or mid two-term periods, those sort of, it invariably happens, Mondale in 84, from the day he's seeking the nomination, he knows it's pretty much, this is just him doing what he's supposed to do because the position that he's in the party, right? We've seen that on the flip side. Maybe it's a Dole in '96. It
Almost even maybe a McCain in
yeah,
'08 when he
yeah,
realized, like, well, what did I just inherit? And there's really no way. You know what I mean?
yeah. And so, the cast of and these are accomplished personas in American history. So I don't want to minimize who they are in any way, shape, or fashion. I mentioned Mondale there, who was a former vice president. And I
Yeah.
mentioned whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, there's a lot of things you have to respect about a Bob Dole at the end of the day, just because of his story, a McCain type of scenario as well. It's true on both sides of the party, but there's folks that had done other things who then played the role of somebody has to go and do this, even though I know the inevitable outcome. That's very different than a scenario like you mentioned there. Again, using McCain as the example in 2008. On the Democratic side in 2008, hey, it's a different story, right? There's lots of people vying because this is actually a chance to get that nomination and actually win.
Mhm.
And I think you would see a different take in 1936 on the Republican side. That's a long way around the block to say that. So I guess that comes back to the ultimate question, because Eric was the one that threw this out. We were talking about this as a topic. Are we sure that Huey Long wins the 1936 election? And if so, if we give that as a grant, I lean towards that as being a yes for a lot of reasons. If we lean towards that, what does that mean for the Long administration starting now in January of 1937? And the deep sighs and silence continues.
Um,
Sometimes you have like a really great idea and you're like, Huey Long as president. And you're thinking, like, you know what? This is going to be full of drama. It's going to be spicy. It's going to be a really good time. And then you think about how to get from A to B. And you're like, okay, we're chugging along. Then you finally arrive at C. And you're just like, oh my God, what would happen? I don't. Like, the man basically became a dictator of Louisiana. Yeah, he did some great things, but also he was kind of a mob boss.
Yeah.
by the way, what happens when you have a mob? So let's say he wins. And if he does win, I do feel like he would probably win in 1940 because he's not stepping down or anything. Oh, and by the way, he's still got 1940 is still a perfectly reasonable term for him. It would not be his third term, it would just be his second. Um then what does the mob boss president do on December 7th?
Well, and that's the thing that popped into my head. You've heard me talk about this before. I think, and this can be a polarizing thought, but I'll go there. I think the president, the George W. Bush presidency that we got, for whatever you think about that, whichever side you sit on that, is very different post 9/11 than the presidency that was destined to be before 9/11. For better or for worse, and I'm not going to go down that path, but I tend to think of his presidency having been hijacked by what happened with a terrorist attack external to whatever he came in with an agenda, and then his agenda, again, whether you want to say for better or for worse, changed because of external factors. And so the first thing that pops in my mind for Huey Long is, okay, we've been thinking primarily about economy and domestic agenda here, right? We've talked very little or not at all about your point about international relations, Chris. You've got Huey Long in the lead up to World War II. You've got appeasement in Europe going on. You've got the isolationist tendencies of the United States. And then early in his second term, you have the bombing of Pearl Harbor with Long sitting in the chair versus Roosevelt sitting in the chair, by the way, that has wheels. just to bring that also in perspective there as well. And Long being more of a populist out in front of the people than Roosevelt could be because of what I just described there, which is, I think, also part of the truth. So what's different in the Long presidency that has nothing to do with economics and domestic, but has to do with foreign policy?
Well, do you want to hear who is Secretary of State he proposed in his book, My First Days in the White House?
Yeah, I'd love to hear that.
Okay, he does not name a vice president. He did say that he wanted to reorganize and modernize the Army and the Air Forces. Secretary of State, William Edgar Bora, Republican of Idaho. Secretary of the Treasury, James J. Cousins, also Republican of Michigan. Smedley Butler, as Secretary of War. He wanted FDR to be Secretary of the Navy, which I have to say, that is such what a power move to say, like, I will make the current president my Secretary of the Navy. I feel wild.
Yes.
Secretary of the Interior, Little Brown. Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce. Frank Murphy as Attorney General, and Edward Keating as Secretary of Labor. So very much to Chris's point from earlier, very much I'm not left wing, I'm not right wing, I'm.
Couple of things I will say. One, Bora had some pretty nice things to say about Hitler and was pretty isolationist that at least we shouldn't be involved in that. Long himself, while he was in, the term he did serve in the Senate, came out and said that taking the Philippines and Cuba was a mistake, that we should not have been involved in either the Spanish American or the First World War, and that we should grant independence to the Philippines. So, very isolationist. So I don't think he does anything to support Europe the way Roosevelt did. And for those of you that have listened to me a couple of times, I keep asking this question. I'm going to ask it again. Japan wants to attack the European colonies. They attacked the United States because of the Philippines. One, we didn't have any treaties that required us to. Two, if we granted the Philippines independence in his first term, China, yeah, I see Don's head shaking. China's still going. Japan can take all of Southeast Asia, maybe even Australia and New Zealand, with no fear whatsoever of American involvement. Because
so what you're saying is Huey Long prevents us from getting into war with Japan. Give that man the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm sorry. That was too dark.
I mean, it is certainly an argument to be made that you would have an American fortress. I think that's kind of what he pictured it, an American fortress of a reformed armed services, but not using it and letting Europe settle their own hash, which Europe and Asia both, not getting involved in either one of them.
Yeah, and I even struggle. I think we often overlook how easy it would have been for the United States in a number of different ways to go down that path without Roosevelt sitting in the Oval Office. I think we just take for granted, if you will, the history we know and assume that others in that role would have done the same, because I think it's easy to overlook just how strong the isolationist across both parties presence was prior to the galvanizing event of Pearl Harbor. And to your point, Chris, if there's no reason for the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor and there's nobody who is thinking Lend-Lease or what do we do to prop up Great Britain, it's a very different world. It's a very different world. I mean, you start running that fork a little ways, and those ripples a little ways, they go a long way, and it changes a lot. And um, one of the things that I think of there again, that idea of the hijacked presidency. If Long is dealing with a delayed start to now doing things that are fixing the depression, he's much more focused on that because it's 37 before things really get sort of rolling here instead of 33. Um, you're not going to let you're not going to take your eye off the ball of this domestic situation that you're dealing with because of all this. Like, even more reason to be isolationist. We have our own problems to deal with here. Europe, Europe be damned. Asia be damned. As you said, they can sort their stuff out. We have stuff we need to be taken care of here. I think that's a fair place to imagine Long or anybody else sitting in the presidency starting in 37 being in that place with an R or a D after their name, either one.
So that begs then the question. Gun to your head, you have to choose Charles Lindbergh as president in 1936 or Huey Long president in 1936.
I'll take Long any day.
Yeah, I will
Yeah.
too. But it says a lot that's out there that question is out there. That's a legitimate question if you remove Roosevelt.
Yeah.
We used to have this conversation a lot in the early days of the podcast, and we come back around to it again. We've invoked Brant Frost a lot today, and I'll do it again here. One of the conversations we used to have on air during podcasts, but also off air, was this idea of the great man or great persona of history versus this flow of history. I think arguably there is a flow of history that Roosevelt plays into, but it's one of those instances where the persona met the moment. The person met the moment in time in such a way that when you take the person out, you change more than you think that you might because of the role of the person being present or not there. Another Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, I think fits that description well.
Yeah.
There's others that come after them that fit that description as well. But I think it's very true of FDR that there's a reason why, as a persona, he has the influence of history. It's because of what's going on in history, but also his persona in that role at the time. And that carries initially. I mean, you might think of his presidency sort of in two parts. The first part of his presidency is the domestic part, and the second part of his presidency is the foreign relations part. And it's interesting that, they obviously overlap. He's the president dealing with both in both instances, but they so define his presidency during different parts of his presidency, just the way that they do, if that makes any sense. It's like part one and part two with a fine line clearly drawn December 7th, 1941.
I don't know, Don. His song does say, "There'll be peace without end, every neighbor a friend, and every man a king."
There you go. There's Huey. Well, and the other thing, I just, being from Texas, I fundamentally have issues trying to figure out how somebody ever gets elected from the state directly to the east. But that's a whole other electoral challenge here. And back to Eric's earlier point, you mentioned the divide potentially that arises inside the Democratic Party. That's a precursor for what is going to happen in the Democratic Party further down the road, where you actually do have sort of the formal challenge in the form of the Dixiecrats, which comes along because the tent is so big that it's covering so much that there's room for multiple tents inside the tent, right?
Yeah. Well, I live in Arizona, but I'm struggling to remember his name. He ran against LBJ.
Goldwater.
Goldwater. I know it was gold something, but it wasn't coming to mind. I'm still surprised to just drive around Phoenix and see so many places named after Goldwater and just pass it by like, well, he was a segregationist. Okay. We still have a major thoroughfare called Indian School. To
By
be
the
fair.
way, Don, just a point of fact. You can say whatever you want about that place to the east. We have doubled the amount of actual Texans ever to hold the presidency on this episode. Okay?
Well, there you go. And again, you put the qualifier there, actual Texans. I understand what you did there, but that's true. That's true. And I'm actually just trying to think: has there ever been? There's never been a president from Louisiana. Is that correct? Am I correct in that?
I think you are correct.
Yeah. So the irony is that Louisiana Purchase that doubled the size of the territory has still not produced a president from the state that drew its name from part of that territory. So there you go.
I am struggling. I believe I'm going to put this out there. I believe Herbert Hoover might have been the first from the Louisiana Territory.
I think you may be right.
From a state that turned in, yeah.
And it really just struck me earlier when Eric talked about how old John Nance Garner was, that he goes back to a period of time when, we're talking about after the Civil War and the period of time after that in terms of when you're born. So, so there you go. All right.
Herbert Hoover was born in Iowa.
Which debatably, that was Louisiana Territory. It was over the river.
Yeah.
There you go. All right. What did we miss here? So we got Long. So we decided that it's a Long presidency. So Chris, do you think he manages between 37 and the outbreak of the war to make up some of the lost Roosevelt time to be a position there? And do you see Long as, what do you see when December 7th comes? What do you see Long being? Because I don't think he's Roosevelt like Roosevelt is before December 7th.
I don't think December 7th comes.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of an old joke that asked, do they have the 4th of July in Canada? And the right answer is then what comes after the 3rd of July?
Yeah.
It's just another day. I think what I laid out, that Long, because again, there had already been a pretty significant Philippine independence movement. MacArthur was actually already out there to command their army. I think they're an independent nation where the United States does not have any, we'll still have a alliance or whatever, but I've keep coming back to this. The Japanese don't have to attack us. They don't have to. That was completely their choice. And I think if we have a more tenuous relationship with the Philippines, they go into Southeast Asia, and I don't see anything. I don't see a Long government doing anything. Now, I'd be open to the argument, and we could play this out. I don't think we get involved then. I don't think he gets us involved at all. I'm looking at a clock, and we've kind of shot how long this episode is going to be, but I'm going to power through it. Long in 44, does he run? I think he runs. At some point, Long is going to die, and you're going to be in a position where you've got a fascist Europe and an imperialist Asia. And I think you might have the next another American president might get us involved. I'm not even sure about that. And what does that mean? What does that look like? Because that is, so far down the road. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then the thing that jumps into my head there, Chris, the straight up question is, without American involvement, what is the outcome in Europe? Eventually, does Great Britain fall? Does it take Great Britain being on the verge of falling to actually finally wake America out of some form of isolationism, but it's now too late to be effective about that? I mean, what becomes the end game? Let's forget the war in Asia. I'm just talking about the war in Europe at this point. What becomes the end game of that scenario if America, doesn't get involved in 41, 42?
Before you say anything, Chris.
Yeah.
Let's all agree that this is the beginning of a pilot that we will sell to, I'm thinking, Showtime, AMC, maybe FX. Keep
Under
that on.
absolutely no circumstances is it Apple Plus. That's all I have to say.
Absolutely not. We are a production company of the
Ah.
people.
By the way, whenever somebody does make a me like bingo card, come back to this episode because I'm firing on everything.
Yeah, you're hitting there. You're there.
I think I don't think Britain falls. I don't think Hitler didn't want to actually invade Britain. I think they've still got the Navy. None of our aid actually changed that. I think we would be more than happy to sell them all the oil from Texas we wanted to. We could. I think what you see is the Soviet Union getting dismembered by between I actually think a independent Philippines and no American pressure there makes a Japanese gobbling up of Southeast Asia that much easier. And then they turn north. There was an argument about them turning north initially. If they don't meet any resistance, which they wouldn't in this scenario, they turn north and dismember the Soviet Union in conjunction with Germany. That's where you start seeing changes on that great Eurasian landmass.
Yeah.
That's a very different into World War II and a very different post-war scenario, obviously, than the real timeline. I mean, that is substantially different.
But I think it's very realistic. He doesn't worry about it. He doesn't need to take England. So I think, your question of what happens to England doesn't matter. I think it's the Soviet Union collapses and they probably lose India. At some point, they just become some islands. You're going to have, in a lot of scenarios, I'm thinking about, for those of you that are familiar with Hearts of Iron, like a Kaiserreich scenario where Germany wins World War One. Britain, in a lot of alternate history scenarios, winds up just sitting as this island out there, and eventually they get bored being at war, so they sign a treaty. And I think that's what's going to happen. They'll get bored being at war with Nazi Germany as like the main power of everything. They're not seeing any conflict. They're not fighting anywhere. There's really no point to staying at war.
There are times when we go down alternate timelines that my brain just stops, Chris. And the reason is it becomes so foreign to what we know that, when I start trying to think through all the little bitty ripples, I can't even grasp the big ripple because it's just so fundamentally different, right? And that becomes one of those things. What I think of as the World War I, World War II continuous conflict in the early part of the 20th century. Arguably, it rolls over into the Cold War, even, into this continuous type of thing to a degree, is it so shadows after that point, now almost 80 years after the point that, it's hard to imagine a scenario where it doesn't happen the way that it happens. It just gets so foreign to where we are now that it's not even just a different timeline, it's just a different world at that point, if that makes any sense. So the bottom line is, if you're gonna have those pivotal points in history, going back to February of 1933 and whether FDR lives or dies seems now pretty important in the overall scope of things.
I mean, when in any situation where you wind up killing one president and saving somebody else to put them in a presidency, stuff can get weird quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just think about it this way. All of the because we've essentially put a strong man in charge of America. Like, a lot of people accused FDR of being a strong man himself, but when FDR died, our system stayed in place through Truman, and then we self-corrected to ensure that hopefully constitutionally it would never happen where someone goes over their term limits. But in this world where that will probably not happen, and all of the strongmen are of about the same age, imagine what happens in that world when they all die of complications from old age all at the same time.
It's a different, it's a different world. I just described there, and Chris laying out the thing, just this is how it doesn't go down. And because it's a different world, it's a different United States. It's a very different United States. The United States before World War II, the American involvement in World War I is real, but it's so late and sort of what it is. It's not the same type of involvement that the other, major conflict powers had during the war. World War II is a different story for the United States. The thing that I'm looking over here at my bookshelf, I'm seeing, Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation. That generation is forged in what happens to them during the Second World War. A lot of them lose their lives during that conflict. Change that scenario, you change America as you know it in ways that may be better, may be worse, but just would definitely look very different than they do right now. And you change the face of Europe, and you change the face of, by the time you've changed Europe, Asia, and the United States, you've changed a pretty substantial part of the world as we know it. And we did this all without Eric's benefit of either saving or killing presidents. So it's imagine what we would have done if Eric Rush were around to help us along the path. It could have even been bigger.
So on Patreon, for our supporters, if you want to see us write the Huey Long pseudo-documentary about what happens to our poor little world in a Huey Long presidency, please back us.
Pitching a title, The Long Game.
You mean for this episode or for that book?
¿Por qué no los dos?
Yeah.
My working title in my head, because I'm always thinking about what the title of it. Yeah. My title for this episode was Long Shot. Was actually what I was thinking about for the title for this episode, and probably just made it that just by speaking it out into the world, so we can save the long game for the novelization that Eric Darling Bond's going to write, and we will sell via Patreon. So that's how
we'll give it to Paramount Plus. The Fisher King. No, Fisher King doesn't work.
No, and we run into copyright infringement issues there, I think, as a result of the Robin Williams movie and just the concept in general. I'm going to close this out here, guys. Any closing thoughts?
I need to sit in a room for a while and just think.
I have a whole series of other episodes here about Japan and Asia, but that's a conversation we'll have offline, Chris, about that whole concept of what goes on there. All right, Eric, appreciate you. Chris, I appreciate you. As we close out here, I'm just going to remind our listeners, we invite you to visit our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Eric mentioned it. If you like the podcast, you want to give us some financial support to help defray the costs, you can do that through our Patreon, which you'll find linked there, or we have the merchandise page. We don't make a lot of money, but there's some merch there, so you can support the podcast through that. But mainly, we just appreciate the fact that you listen, and we'd love for you to go to the website to give us feedback, topical suggestions. Go to our Discord. For almost all of our episodes, we throw them up on Discord as a place for folks to comment and give us some feedback. One of the things the team has talked about is actually reading those feedback, and then in subsequent episodes when we record, sort of commenting on those things. So, creating that, viewer listener mailbag kind of concept going on there with our Discord server. And so a place that you can join us there. So Chris, we normally suggest, and Eric, we normally suggest to our listeners, if they happen upon a fork, we have some advice for them. If it's a fork in time, what do we think they ought to do?
Take it.
Take it. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.